Every decision you've made today, what to eat, whether to respond to that message, whether to speak up in a meeting or stay quiet, was shaped by emotion far more than most people realize, and far more than the popular image of emotion as some irrational static interfering with clear logical thinking would suggest. I want to walk you through what modern neuroscience actually says about how emotions work, how they shape attention and decision-making at a genuinely mechanistic level, whether the popular idea that emotions get stored in your body holds up scientifically, whether facial expressions are the reliable window into internal emotional states that most people assume they are, and critically, what the actual evidence-based tools for improving emotion regulation look like, including two we'll cover in real depth: cognitive reappraisal and deliberate cold exposure. Let's start with a foundational reframing, because I think this is genuinely where a lot of popular understanding of emotion goes wrong from the very beginning. The classical view, still deeply embedded in a lot of casual conversation, treats emotion and rational thought as separate, often competing systems, with emotion frequently framed as the primitive, animalistic force that a more evolved, rational brain has to work to override or suppress. Modern affective neuroscience has moved considerably away from this framing, and for good reason. Research examining the brain regions involved in emotional processing has found extensive bidirectional connectivity between these regions and the areas involved in attention, memory, and decision-making, to the point where trying to cleanly separate emotional brain regions from rational ones has become genuinely difficult to sustain as a coherent anatomical claim, citation. This integrated view of emotion and cognition, challenging the traditional separation between emotional and rational brain systems, has been established extensively in affective neuroscience research, discussed in reviews published in journals including Trends in Cognitive Sciences and Nature Reviews Neuroscience. Let me bring in some of the specific foundational research demonstrating why emotion and decision-making can't actually be cleanly separated, because I think this is considerably more compelling when grounded in specific findings rather than left as an abstract claim. Neuroscientist Antonio Damasio's research on patients with damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, a brain region centrally involved in integrating emotional signals into decision-making, produced a genuinely striking, somewhat counterintuitive finding. These patients typically retained fully intact logical reasoning capacity. They could still perform well on standard IQ tests and abstract reasoning tasks, and yet they showed profound, often catastrophic impairments in real-world decision-making, repeatedly making poor financial and personal choices despite being able to correctly verbally articulate why those choices were poor. Citation: this research on ventromedial prefrontal cortex damage and its dissociation between preserved abstract reasoning and impaired real-world decision-making was established through Damasio's somatic marker hypothesis. Research published extensively in journals including Cognition and summarized in his influential work on emotion and decision-making. This is genuinely important because it directly demonstrates that emotion isn't simply noise interfering with otherwise clean, rational decision-making in these patients. Removing the emotional signal didn't produce better decisions. It produced considerably worse ones, suggesting emotional processing provides genuinely necessary information that pure logical reasoning on its own cannot adequately substitute for. Let me bring in the somatic marker hypothesis specifically now, since this is Damasio's own theoretical framework for explaining exactly why this happens, and I think it deserves direct explanation. The hypothesis proposes that as you go through life, you accumulate learned associations between certain choices or situations and the emotional and physiological states that resulted from similar choices in the past, and these accumulated associations, somatic markers, get triggered rapidly, often below conscious awareness, whenever you're facing a similar decision again, functioning as a kind of rapid embodied gut check that biases you toward or away from specific options before slower deliberate reasoning has even fully engaged. Citation: this somatic marker hypothesis, proposing that bodily and emotional signals guide decision-making through learned associations operating largely outside conscious awareness, was developed by Damasio and colleagues, published extensively in research, summarized in journals including Cognition and Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. This offers a genuinely useful mechanistic explanation for the common experience of having a strong gut feeling about a decision before you can fully consciously articulate why. That feeling likely reflects exactly this rapid learned emotional signal, drawing on accumulated past experience, arriving before your slower, more deliberate reasoning process has caught up. Now let's talk about attention specifically, since I think this deserves genuinely direct, dedicated treatment beyond the broader decision-making conversation we just had. Research has found that emotionally significant stimuli capture attention considerably faster and more automatically than neutral stimuli, a phenomenon sometimes studied through what's called the emotional Stroop task, where participants show measurably slower response times when trying to name the color of emotionally threatening words compared to neutral words, since the emotional content of the word automatically captures attentional resources that then have to be actively redirected toward the actual task, citation, this emotional attentional capture phenomenon, demonstrated through emotional Stroop and related experimental paradigms, has been examined extensively in cognitive and affective neuroscience research published in journals including Psychological Bulletin and Emotion. I want to bring in something about the amygdala's specific role in this process, since we've discussed this structure in previous videos in the context of fear and freezing responses, but its role in ordinary, everyday attentional capture deserves separate direct mention here. Research has found that the amygdala, beyond its role in fear processing, specifically functions more broadly as a kind of relevance detector, rapidly evaluating incoming sensory information for personal significance, and then through direct projections to sensory cortex, actually enhancing the neural processing of that specific information, essentially biasing your perception itself toward whatever your emotional system has flagged as significant before you've had any conscious opportunity to decide what deserves your attention, citation. This amygdala-mediated enhancement of sensory processing for emotionally significant stimuli, operating through direct projections to sensory cortical regions, has been established extensively in neuroscience research, published in journals including Nature Reviews, Neuroscience, and Neuron. Let me address something about how this attentional capture connects to memory formation as well, since I think it rounds out the picture considerably. Emotionally significant events are consistently remembered more vividly and more durably than neutral events, and research has found this reflects genuine, measurable differences in how the brain encodes these memories, with the amygdala directly modulating memory consolidation processes happening in the hippocampus during and immediately after an emotionally arousing experience, essentially tagging that specific memory for stronger, more durable storage, citation. This amygdala-mediated enhancement of memory consolidation for emotionally arousing experiences has been established extensively in memory neuroscience research, including foundational work by James McGaugh and colleagues, published in journals including Nature Reviews, Neuroscience. This entire chain, attention, decision-making, and memory, all being genuinely shaped by emotional processing at a mechanistic neural level, is really the core reframing I want you to walk away with from this first section. Emotion isn't a separate system layered on top of cognition that occasionally interferes with it. It's woven directly into the machinery of attention, decision-making, and memory formation from the ground up. Let me address the question of whether emotions get stored in the body now, since I think this represents a genuinely widespread popular claim that deserves careful, precise scientific treatment, distinguishing what's genuinely supported from what's considerably more metaphorical or overstated. The popular version of this claim, often expressed as something like unprocessed emotions, particularly from past trauma, becoming literally lodged or trapped within specific muscles or organs, waiting to be released through targeted body work or physical practice, doesn't have strong, direct empirical support in the specific literal form. It's usually presented in casual wellness content, citation needed for direct, controlled research, specifically validating the literal claim that discrete emotional experiences become stored within particular muscle groups or organs in a way that can be reliably located and released through targeted physical intervention. Since this specific Literal formulation remains largely outside what's been rigorously tested in controlled neuroscience research. That said, and I think this nuance genuinely matters, there's a related, considerably more scientifically grounded phenomenon that likely explains why this popular claim resonates with so many people's genuine lived experience. Chronic stress and unresolved emotional distress are well documented to produce measurable, sustained changes in the body, chronically elevated muscle tension, particularly in areas like the shoulders, jaw, and neck, altered breathing patterns, and genuine, measurable dysregulation of your autonomic nervous system. The balance between its sympathetic, activating branch, and its parasympathetic, calming branch, citation. This relationship between chronic emotional stress and sustained physiological changes, including muscle tension and autonomic dysregulation, has been established extensively in psychophysiology and stress research published in journals, including Psychosomatic Medicine and the Annual Review of Psychology. So while the literal claim of a specific emotion being trapped in a specific muscle waiting for release doesn't hold up to rigorous scrutiny, the broader, more general principle that chronic emotional states produce genuine, measurable, sustained physical consequences throughout your body is genuinely well established. And this is likely why body-based interventions, massage, certain forms of movement therapy, deep breathing practices do genuinely help many people process difficult emotional states, not because they're releasing a discrete, previously trapped emotion from a specific location, but because they're directly addressing the genuine, physiologically real muscular tension and autonomic dysregulation that chronic emotional distress produces. Let me bring in interoception here as well, since I think this represents the genuinely scientifically rigorous piece of the body-emotion relationship that deserves careful, dedicated explanation and connects directly to the somatic marker hypothesis we discussed earlier. Interoception refers to your brain's ongoing perception of internal bodily states, heart rate, breathing, gut sensations, and research has found that the accuracy and sensitivity of someone's interoceptive awareness correlates directly with the intensity and clarity of their subjective emotional experience with a specific brain region, the insula, functioning as a central integration hub for this interoceptive information and appearing to play a genuinely central role in constructing subjective emotional experience from that raw, ongoing bodily signal citation. The central role of interoception and insular cortex function in constructing subjective emotional experience has been established extensively in interoceptive neuroscience research, published in journals including Nature Reviews, Neuroscience, and Trends in Cognitive Sciences. This offers a genuinely more precise, more scientifically defensible version of the emotions live in the body claim. Your emotional experience genuinely does depend heavily on ongoing signals from your body, processed and integrated by your brain. It's just a considerably more distributed, continuously integrated process than the popular image of discrete emotions being stored and later released from specific locations. Now let's address the second major question this video is built around: whether facial expressions are actually the reliable, universal signal of internal emotional states that popular psychology and a considerable amount of earlier academic research has long assumed. This represents a genuinely important area where the scientific consensus has shifted considerably over recent decades, and I think walking through that shift carefully matters. The classical view, established largely through research by psychologist Paul Ekman beginning in the 1960s and 70s, proposed that a specific set of basic emotions, happiness, sadness, anger, fear, disgust, and surprise, are associated with universal, biologically hardwired facial expressions, recognized consistently across radically different cultures, even those with minimal prior contact with Western media or culture. Citation, this classical universal basic emotions framework, and the cross-cultural facial expression recognition research supporting it was established through Ekman's foundational research, published extensively in journals including the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. This framework became enormously influential, and it's still the model underlying a huge amount of popular content about reading emotions from facial expressions, lie detection training, and even certain artificial intelligence systems designed to automatically classify emotional states from facial images. But more recent Considerably more rigorous meta-analytic research has found that this framework significantly overstates the reliability of the relationship between specific facial configurations and specific internal emotional states. A comprehensive review commissioned by the Association for Psychological Science, examining the full body of available evidence, found that the actual scientific support for reliably inferring specific emotions from facial movements alone is considerably weaker than the popular version of Ekman's original theory suggests, with the review's authors concluding that a scowl, for instance, is not a universal, reliable expression of anger. People scowl in anger only a fraction of the time, and they also scowl when concentrating, when confused, or in various other states entirely unrelated to anger. Citation: Barrett, Adolphs, Marcella, Martinez, and Pollack. This comprehensive review examining the scientific evidence for and against reliable inference of emotion from facial expressions was published in Psychological Science in the public interest. Let me bring in Lisa Feldman Barrett's broader theoretical work here, since I think it offers a genuinely important alternative framework for understanding what's actually happening when we experience and express emotion, one that helps explain why the classical universal expression model has struggled under more rigorous scrutiny. Barrett's theory of constructed emotion proposes that emotions aren't discrete, biologically pre-programmed reactions that get triggered and then expressed through a fixed universal facial template. Instead, she argues, the brain continuously constructs emotional experiences in real time, drawing on interoceptive signals from the body alongside prior experience, cultural learning, and the specific context of the current situation, meaning the same underlying physiological state, elevated heart rate, for instance, can be constructed and experienced as excitement, anxiety, or anger, depending on the surrounding context, and a person's individual history. Citation: this theory of constructed emotion, proposing that emotional experience and expression are actively constructed rather than triggered from a fixed universal template, has been developed extensively by Lisa Feldman Barrett, published in journals including Psychological Review, and summarized in her broader body of published research on affective science. I want to bring in something about the practical implications of this shift for anyone trying to actually read other people's emotional states, since I think this is where the theoretical debate becomes genuinely useful. Practical information. If facial expressions are considerably less reliable, universal indicators of specific internal emotional states than commonly assumed, this has genuine implications for fields that have historically relied heavily on this assumption, including certain approaches to lie detection training, security screening protocols designed to flag suspicious facial expressions, and automated emotion recognition artificial intelligence systems that have been trained on data sets built around the classical universal expression assumption. Citation: these practical implications and concerns regarding facial expression-based technologies and training programs, given the weaker than assumed scientific support for universal emotion expression, have been discussed extensively in the same Psychological Science in the Public Interest Review and subsequent commentary in affective science and applied psychology literature. This is genuinely important, practical context. If you've ever taken a course or read popular content claiming you can reliably detect deception or specific emotional states purely from someone's facial expression, the underlying scientific foundation for that specific claim is considerably shakier than the confident popular framing usually suggests. I want to be genuinely balanced here, though, since I don't want to overstate the correction in the opposite direction. Some emotional expressions do show meaningfully above chance recognition rates across cultures, and facial expression clearly does carry genuine, useful communicative information in many contexts. It's simply considerably less like a fixed, universal, one-to-one code than the classical model proposed, and considerably more dependent on context, individual variation, and cultural learning than popular psychology often suggests. Citation: this more nuanced, moderate position, acknowledging genuine but context-dependent and imperfect facial expression communication, has been articulated in follow-up commentary and research building on the original Barrett and colleagues review. Now let's move into the genuinely practical, actionable core of this video, the tools that actual research supports for improving emotion regulation, starting with cognitive reappraisal, since it represents one of the most extensively studied, most consistently supported emotion regulation strategies in the entire psychological literature. Cognitive reappraisal involves deliberately reframing how you think about a given situation in order to change its emotional impact, and it sits within a broader theoretical framework developed by researcher James Gross called the process model of emotion regulation, which identifies several distinct points in the unfolding of an emotional response where regulation can occur, situation selection, situation modification, attentional deployment, cognitive change, and response modulation, with cognitive reappraisal, specifically representing the cognitive change strategy, intervening relatively early in the emotional generation process before the full emotional response has fully unfolded. Citation. This process model of emotion regulation, identifying multiple distinct points of intervention, including cognitive reappraisal, was developed by James Gross, published extensively in journals including Review of General Psychology and the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. Let me bring in the specific comparative research demonstrating why reappraisal's early stage timing matters so much, since I think this is genuinely one of the more important, practically useful findings in this entire body of research. Research directly comparing cognitive reappraisal against expressive suppression, meaning simply trying to hide or mask the outward expression of an emotion without actually changing your underlying interpretation of the triggering situation, has consistently found reappraisal to be considerably more effective, both in terms of subjective emotional experience and in terms of measurable physiological stress markers. Citation. This comparative research demonstrating reappraisal's superior effectiveness compared to suppression has been examined extensively in research led by James Gross and colleagues, published in journals including the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. Suppression, precisely because it intervenes so late in the emotional process, after the full physiological and subjective emotional response has already been generated, requires ongoing effortful cognitive resources simply to maintain the mask, and research has found it's associated with increased sympathetic nervous system activation, worse memory for the details of the suppressed interaction, and reduced relationship satisfaction in the people interacting with the person doing the suppressing, who often unconsciously pick up on the effortful, incongruent quality of a suppressed emotional display. Citation. These negative correlates of expressive suppression, including increased physiological arousal, impaired memory, and interpersonal costs, have been examined extensively in emotion regulation research published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology and Emotion. Let me address something about the neuroimaging research on reappraisal specifically here, since I think seeing the actual brain mechanism involved adds genuine, concrete grounding to this conversation. Research using functional MRI to examine brain activity during cognitive reappraisal tasks has consistently found a pattern involving increased activation in regions of the prefrontal cortex associated with cognitive control and reinterpretation, occurring alongside decreased activity in the amygdala, the threat detection and emotional arousal structure we've discussed extensively throughout previous videos. Citation. This pattern of increased prefrontal engagement alongside reduced amygdala activation during successful cognitive reappraisal has been demonstrated extensively in affective neuroscience research published in journals including Neuroimage and Social Cognitive and Affective Neuroscience. This is genuinely important. It directly demonstrates that reappraisal isn't simply a matter of subjectively deciding to feel differently about something. It involves a genuine, measurable shift in the balance of activity between your brain's cognitive control systems and its emotional arousal systems, with the prefrontal cortex essentially exerting top-down regulatory influence over the amygdala's activity level. I want to be genuinely precise about what effective reappraisal actually looks like in practice, since I think a lot of popular content oversimplifies this into something that sounds like simply forcing artificial positivity onto a genuinely difficult situation. Research has found that effective reappraisal isn't about denying that a situation is difficult or forcing an inauthentic positive spin onto something genuinely negative. And research has actually found that this kind of forced inauthentic positive reframing can sometimes be counterproductive, occasionally increasing distress rather than reducing it. Citation: this counterproductive effect of forced or inauthentic positive reframing, as distinct from genuine, accurate cognitive reappraisal, has been discussed in emotion regulation research examining the boundary conditions and limitations of reappraisal effectiveness. Effective reappraisal instead involves finding a genuinely more accurate, more complete way of thinking about a situation, one that honestly acknowledges real difficulty while identifying genuine, evidence-based alternative interpretations or sources of meaning that a narrower, more catastrophic initial interpretation might have overlooked. Essentially, expanding your interpretation of a situation to include information you have access to but weren't initially incorporating, rather than simply painting over genuine difficulty with artificial cheerfulness. Let me bring in something about the specific technique of self-distancing here as well, since it connects to a previous video on self-talk but deserves reintroduction here specifically as a form of reappraisal. Using your own name, or a second-person you framing, rather than immersed first-person I framing, when reflecting on a stressful situation, has been found in research to produce measurably reduced amygdala activation and improved subsequent performance, functioning essentially as a specific, well-studied technique for achieving reappraisal by creating genuine psychological distance from the immediate emotional intensity of a situation. Citation: this self-distancing technique and its measurable neural and behavioral benefits has been examined extensively in research led by Ethan Cross and colleagues, published in journals including the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. Now let's turn to the second major tool this video is specifically built around: deliberate cold exposure. Since this represents a genuinely different category of intervention, working through physiological rather than purely cognitive means, and I think it deserves careful, precise treatment given how much popular enthusiasm and, frankly, overstated claims surround this specific practice online. Let's start with the actual, well-documented physiological mechanism. Deliberate exposure to cold water or cold air triggers a substantial, measurable increase in circulating norepinephrine, to a somewhat lesser degree, dopamine, with research finding that cold water immersion specifically can produce norepinephrine increases considerably larger than those typically seen with other common interventions. Citation: this substantial norepinephrine and dopamine release triggered by cold water exposure has been examined in research published in the European Journal of Applied Physiology and related exercise and environmental physiology literature. I want to explain why this specific neurochemical response connects directly to emotion regulation, since I think the mechanistic link deserves genuine, direct explanation rather than simply asserting that cold exposure is beneficial. Norepinephrine plays a central role in your brain's arousal and alertness systems, and deliberately, voluntarily exposing yourself to a genuinely uncomfortable, physiologically arousing stressor in a controlled, safe setting, and successfully tolerating it through deliberate breathing and mental composure appears to function as a genuine form of stress inoculation, connecting directly to the framework we discussed extensively in our previous video on the freeze response and training under pressure. Some research in clinical practice built around this principle proposes that repeated voluntary exposure to this kind of controlled physiological stressor may help build genuine transferable capacity to tolerate and regulate through other less controlled, more spontaneously occurring stressful and emotionally arousing situations in daily life, essentially training your nervous system's general capacity to remain composed and functional under genuine physiological arousal. Citation: this stress inoculation framework applied specifically to voluntary cold exposure has been discussed in research and clinical commentary on deliberate, controlled stress exposure practices, building on the broader stress inoculation training literature we've referenced in previous videos on this channel. I want to be genuinely careful and precise here about the current strength of the direct evidence, specifically connecting cold exposure to improved emotion regulation capacity in other unrelated contexts, since I think this is an area where popular enthusiasm has run somewhat ahead of the specific direct research base. Most of the strongest, most rigorously established research on cold exposure concerns its acute effects on catecholamine release, alertness, and certain metabolic and immune markers. Citation: this research on cold exposure's acute effects on catecholamine release and metabolic markers has been examined extensively in environmental and exercise physiology research. The specific claim that repeated cold exposure produces durable, transferable improvements in general emotion regulation capacity beyond the immediate, in-the-moment experience of successfully tolerating the cold itself remains a considerably less directly, rigorously established claim. Citation needed for large-scale, controlled longitudinal research specifically isolating and confirming durable, transferable emotion regulation improvements attributable to a structured cold exposure practice, independent of other lifestyle factors and independent of the acute, in-the-moment stress tolerance experience itself, since this specific extrapolation, while mechanistically plausible given everything we've discussed regarding stress inoculation more broadly, remains considerably less directly tested than the more immediate acute physiological effects. Let me address what the current, more directly established research does support regarding cold exposure and mood specifically, since I think this deserves honest, separate treatment from the broader emotion regulation transfer claim. Some research on regular cold water swimming has found associations with reduced symptoms of depression and anxiety in observational and smaller intervention studies, with proposed mechanisms including the substantial norepinephrine release we discussed, along with potential anti-inflammatory effects and the psychological benefits associated with successfully completing a genuinely challenging, deliberately chosen practice. Citation: this research on regular cold water immersion and its association with reduced depression and anxiety symptoms has been examined in research published in journals including BMJ case reports and subsequent studies on cold water swimming, mental health. I want to be appropriately calibrated here. Much of this specific research remains smaller in scale and observational, rather than large, rigorously controlled randomized trials, similar to caveats we've applied to other emerging research areas throughout this channel. But the general direction is genuinely worth taking seriously as one additional tool, among the others we've discussed throughout this video, worth considering as part of a broader emotion regulation practice. Let me bring in something about the breathing component specifically here as well, since I think this connects directly and usefully back to the breathing research we discussed in our previous video on the freeze response. The specific practice of maintaining slow, controlled breathing while enduring genuine cold discomfort appears to be a genuinely important active component of why cold exposure practice may build broader stress tolerance rather than the cold exposure alone in isolation, since the specific skill being practiced, maintaining voluntary control over your breathing and your composure while your sympathetic nervous system is genuinely, strongly activated, directly mirrors the exact skill relevant to remaining composed and functional during other unrelated high-stress situations, connecting directly to the same underlying prefrontal-driven regulatory capacity we discussed in our previous video on freezing and threat response. Citation: this active role of breathing control during cold exposure as the mechanistically relevant transferable skill component, distinct from cold exposure alone, has been discussed in commentary connecting deliberate cold exposure practice to the broader stress inoculation and breathing regulation research we've referenced throughout this channel. Let me address safety considerations here directly, since I think this genuinely matters given how much enthusiasm surrounds this particular practice. Cold water immersion carries genuine, documented risks, particularly cold shock response, an involuntary gasp reflex, and sudden increase in heart rate and blood pressure that occurs upon sudden cold water immersion, which can be genuinely dangerous, particularly for individuals with underlying cardiovascular conditions, and genuine risk of hypothermia with prolonged exposure. Citation: these genuine safety risks associated with cold water immersion, including cold shock response and hypothermia risk, are well documented in environmental physiology and emergency medicine literature. Anyone considering a structured cold exposure practice, particularly individuals with any underlying cardiovascular condition, should approach this gradually, starting with brief, mild exposure and progressing slowly, and should consult a physician first if they have any relevant cardiovascular risk factors or concerns. Let me bring in one more practical tool briefly here before we close, since I think it deserves at least mention given how directly it connects to the interoception discussion we had earlier in this video. Given that interoceptive accuracy appears to genuinely shape the clarity and intensity of subjective emotional experience, practices that specifically build interoceptive awareness, certain forms of body scan meditation, for instance, connecting to themes we discussed in a previous video on contemplative practice, and the brain have been examined in research as a tool for improving emotion regulation, with the proposed mechanism being that more accurate, more granular interoceptive awareness allows for correspondingly more precise, more differentiated emotional labeling and processing, rather than experiencing a vague, undifferentiated state of generalized distress that's considerably harder to actually work with and regulate effectively. Citation: this relationship between interoceptive awareness training and improved emotional granularity and regulation has been examined in contemplative neuroscience and clinical psychology research published in journals including Frontiers in Psychology. Let me bring this entire considerably long conversation together now into what I actually want you to walk away with. Emotions are not a separate primitive system that interferes with otherwise clean, rational decision-making. Research on patients with damage to emotional processing regions demonstrates they provide genuinely necessary information for effective real-world decision-making, and emotional processing is woven directly into the mechanics of attention and memory formation at a fundamental neural level. The popular claim that specific emotions get literally stored and later released from specific body locations doesn't hold up to rigorous scrutiny in its literal form, but chronic emotional distress genuinely does produce measurable, sustained physiological changes throughout your body. And interoception, your brain's ongoing perception of internal bodily state, plays a genuinely central, well-established role in constructing subjective emotional experience. Facial expressions carry real, but considerably less reliable and considerably more context-dependent communicative information than the classical universal expression model long assumed. A shift with genuine practical implications for anyone relying on facial expression reading as a supposedly precise diagnostic tool. And among the actual evidence-based tools for improving emotion regulation, cognitive reappraisal stands out as one of the most extensively validated, working through a measurable shift in the balance between prefrontal regulatory activity and amygdala arousal, while deliberate cold exposure offers a genuinely interesting, physiologically grounded complementary tool, working through substantial catecholamine release and the practice skill of maintaining composure and controlled breathing under genuine physiological stress, though the specific claim of durable, transferable emotion regulation benefit from cold exposure deserves somewhat more caution than the more immediately, directly established acute physiological effects. This video discusses general neuroscience and psychology research on emotion for informational and educational purposes only, and does not constitute personalized medical or mental health advice. If you are considering a structured cold exposure practice, particularly if you have any underlying cardiovascular condition, consult a qualified physician before beginning and approach any new practice gradually. If you're experiencing persistent difficulty with emotion regulation that's affecting your daily functioning, please consider reaching out to a qualified mental health professional.